Center of Economic Policy Research, CPER, with which I am sure you are all familiar, Professor of International Economics, Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies, Geneva, and a distinguished fellow at an institution with a French name in Singapore. Now, as my colleagues know, I have spent my career basically working on Asia. And so when encountering European names, I typically destroy them. This appears to be the Institute European of Administration of Affairs in Singapore. I don't know, perhaps Beatrice can pronounce it correctly in French. Anyway, the point of today's meeting is the launch of the 25th Geneva Report on the World Economy, this time addressing the issue of climate and debt. The report discusses 6 policy proposals to address how and by whom climate mitigation and adaptation should be paid, considering debt instruments such as sovereign bonds, carbon credits, conditional official grants, and debt relief from both public and private sources. It is a multi-authored report, and we are quite happy to have Beatrice here with us this morning. She was appointed president of the Center for Economic Policy Research in July 2018. Her research addresses policy-related questions in international macroeconomics. Recent publications have focused on reforms of the euro area, debt sustainability, cross-border banking regulation, financial integration, and the global financial architecture. So she knows of what she speaks. So with no further ado, I would like to turn the podium over to Beatrice Weder di Mauro. We will then, after her remarks, open it up for questions from the audience. Beatrice, please.
Thank you very much for having me here this morning in beautiful Washington, where I finally have been able to come back physically. And it is a real pleasure to be at the Peterson Institute. I want to thank the Peterson Institute and Adam Posen in particular for inviting us again to launch this Geneva Report. The CEPR and the Peterson Institute have a long tradition of collaboration, but in particular also of launching the so-called Geneva Reports at Peterson. We also share other things. We share some of the scholars between PIIE and CEPR, and one of them is actually a co-author of this report. Jeremy Settelmeyer used to be here until quite recently, and is now the president of Bruegel in Europe. With respect to your question, the French institution is actually generally pronounced INSEAD, and is nobody knows what the actual French acronym is. But INSEAD, just I do have to say this, is sometimes the #1, sometimes the #2 business school in the world, between France and Singapore. CEPR is not a business school. CEPR is a sister organization of the NBR, but there are 2 little differences. Whereas the NBR, national, stands for US-based, the E does not stand for Europe. It's also economics, but it is mostly European-based, but not exclusively. So CEPR, we have fellows more or less everywhere. And the other difference you may notice is there is a P in CEPR, which is not in NBR, and the P relates to policy. So it is very much in the name, in the NDA, DNA of CEPR to do policy-related work. And the Geneva Report is an example of this. The Geneva Report is generally and always a co-authored, a teamwork, and as you may know, if you have tried to do larger reports in teams, that involves, it's an intense piece of work, and they also tend to try and cover large topics. Certainly here we are in the situation where we are covering a very large topic. I hope the presentation hasn't acquired a life of its own. We certainly have a large team of co-authors, and moreover, among them are economists and lawyers. So All of them, if you recognize some of the names, have a long history of working on sovereign debt issues, sovereign debt restructuring, in particular when it comes to the lawyers. And all of us have more recently become very interested in the question of climate. And now you may say, okay, so they had two great, big current topics, but also maybe two, okay. All right, I think we are ready to start? Okay. But also two important crises. And so the question is, well, is this just simply a perfect storm? Or we have a climate crisis and a debt crisis. And there are sometimes also ideas that there may be easy solutions that just can address both at the same time. So this is the starting point of this report. And by the way that I am expressing this, you already realize that it is, although it's a very rich report, I really encourage you to take one, which you can at the entrance, and for those in the online, you can download it from the CEPR website for free. It's a very rich report. It has, I'm not going to do justice to all the chapters, but there is also something that it's not. And in fact, Olivier Blanchard was pointing that out yesterday. So he was looking at the question from the title under the, with the question, is this, he was looking for a financing for the path to net zero. And this type of financing is not what we are focusing on. Or put differently, our focus is not on the advanced countries. It is on the rest of the world, on the emerging markets financing and climate financing in cases of debt distress. So let me also at the beginning, okay, at the beginning our report was actually called Debt and Climate, and then you know the Geneva Report involves two stages. There is a first stage where we present the draft report and then take on a lot of the comments, and this is now the final report. At the beginning it was Debt and Climate. One of the comments from our discussants was that it should be climate and debt, and that we should first, what am I doing wrong? Should I, yes, I am clicking. So I'm going to start with the climate perspective, and within the climate perspective, there are four views that I'm going to suggest are important when discussing climate and the implications, well, for the planet on the one hand side, and then for financing on the other hand. So the planetary view is the one where it is about the global common. And one way of looking at the planetary view is this chart, which has registered on Mauna Loa the atmospheric CO2 concentrations in parts per million over the years. Just on the bottom line, you have the days, and you see that simply the atmospheric concentration of CO2 is going up every year. So what does this mean? Well, it means that this roof, this greenhouse roof is becoming thicker and is trapping more heat inside. That's what climate, I mean, basically what the warming is about. Now, the second point is how much have we already put into the atmosphere? How much has, since the Industrial Revolution, since people discovered that there are carbon storages in the ground and that you can actually use them in order to power whatever, how much have we additional as humans put into the atmosphere in terms of CO2? And the answer is we have used up about 2,400 gigatons of CO2. I think that's a number worth remembering, 2,400 gigatons, and all the numbers I am using here are straight from the IPCC. So the report which, you know, the group of scientists that come together to agree on what are the scientific basis, and they have a physical science report from last year, so that's where it comes from. So they also then calculate how much is left if the world wanted to stay within the commitment of the 1.5, okay? And this is the table that, that shows this, this distribution of what is left in terms of additional carbon that can be put into the atmosphere. So if we want to actually take very seriously the commitment of staying below the 1.4, with the 2,400 gigatons, what is already in the air, there has already been a warming of about 1.1. So there is left about half a degree to go. And this half a degree will, if we want to only have that half a degree with very high certainty, 83% certainty, then the answer is 300 gigatons left. Now, how much are we spending of that budget per year? Anybody knows? No? About 40. In CO2 terms, it's about 40. In greenhouse gas terms, so methane and other greenhouse gases, it's about 60. But this is only CO2, so, and in fact, this one is already 2 years old, but I'm still using it. So if we want to have no more than 1.5 degrees warming, then there is 300 gigatons left, and we are using up about 40 per year. That's what the scientists tell us. That's what is meant by this carbon budget. Now, what happens if we go over, and it is actually quite likely that we will go over, well, then our certainty of still reaching the 1.5 degrees becomes less. In fact, if we emit 900 gigatons, then we only have 17% chance of still reaching it, right? That's the way it is. But we have a very high chance of ending up at 2%, and 2 degrees, and it doesn't go over that. So that's the way to read this table. In my view, this is one of the most important tables that the IPCC has given us as a, not only as a way to understand what's going on, and as a way to also understand why this type of externality is not the typical type of externality that economists think about. You know, when a typical type of externality, for instance, the neighbor makes noise and then you tax it or you prohibit it, then the noise is gone and you sleep, right? Here, the noise doesn't go away. It accumulates in the air. So if the neighbor makes noise the next evening, the noise of last time is still around. This is why this type of externality, or why it is ultimately a global common, and using it up is the thinking of it in terms of the budget is the right way to think about it. Okay, so this is on the global perspective. Okay, something is a problem with this clicker. Yeah, not moving. Okay, so am I moving it? Yes, I am. Just let me show you, this is one depiction, and here it's greenhouse gases, not CO2, which is why it's 60 rather than 40. This is John Durr, who is, has written a book very recently called Speed and Scale, and he has a pathway to net zero. And this gives you an idea of where the tons are in terms of the different types of activities that create emissions at the global level. And that shows you, although we talk a lot about transport, and transport is only 6 gigatons, the big emissions are in the way that we produce electricity. As a globe, we produce it with oil and gas and coal. Then there is the way that we make food, and protecting nature. That is actually, right now nature is contributing to CO2 emissions. Amazon, for instance, is a net contributor, net emitter of CO2 because land use change is so large. But the main reason why I'm showing this is because, well, one, because I think it's very important to understand the global problem that we have in order to get to net zero, but the net is also important to understand that even somebody who has a very, very positive view of technology and is, very much let's go get it approach in his book, says, okay, there are about 10 gigatons that we cannot mitigate. They will have to be cleaned up, meaning removed in some way. Yeah, we moved either through natural means or through technological means out of the atmosphere in order to come to net zero over the next 3 decades. Okay, so this is the challenge at the planetary scale. Now let's look at how this challenge is distributed still at the planetary scale. At the planet does not care where a ton of carbon is emitted and who does so, but people tend to care. And here is how they are distributed. So the biggest emitter, this is the size of countries by their emissions in total, not per capita, but in total. So the biggest emitter by far is China. It's almost double the US, and the US in turn is about double of Europe. So those are the 3 big ones. Yeah? But very quickly growing, and you also already see them on the map, is India. And what you do not see on this map is Africa. You know, except for South Africa. Africa is not an emitter at all in this global picture. Yeah? So, by the way, in terms of China, it is a recent thing, and that I think is very remarkable too. This happened within about 10, 15 years. China, growing like China meant mostly coal. And this is why it went from being about the size of Europe in terms of carbon tons to being double of the US. Okay, so that's the planetary perspective. Now there is another perspective which is important, that's the local perspective. So here we're talking more about the question, what happens when if we go over the 1.5, and I think the probability of that happening is rather large, who will then need to somehow adjust, or who will be vulnerable? And this map here shows the darker, the higher are the risk indices, and these are now risk indices that are being used in the profession, but also in the financial sectors to calculate risks of climate, so climate change induced risk. And here you do see Africa on the map very much, right? So it's the tropics essentially is what you can take away, are much more vulnerable, and the others, that is not surprising, the ones that are most vulnerable to rising sea changes are small islands, or not necessarily small, but flat islands. And so in some of them, up to 50% of the population now, where the population is living, is vulnerable to sea level rises. So this, what follows from this, and by the way, even if we stay at 1.5, severity of natural disasters will increase. That's basically is baked in. We are not. Nobody is attempting to, or is saying we can go back to the levels of carbon in the atmosphere that we had before the Industrial Revolution. So the need for adaptation investment is largest in, let's call it the global south, you can call it the tropics. It is, and it's not where the emissions are. Yeah. And here's another perspective, conservation. Well, biodiversity is increasingly becoming something that people realize that is an important value in its own. But the question is also, how is biodiversity at risk from global warming? And the answer, again, from IPCC is it's very strongly at risk, especially if you go above the 2%, any of the areas that are darkish brownish here, at high risk, essentially the biodiversity, these are hotspots of high biodiversity, essentially they go they go to zero, they more or less disappear. And again, the distribution you see here, you see some Africa, a lot of the Amazonas basin, it's more distributed. If you think about this in terms of not only risk, but also providing biodiversity services to the world, there are quite a number of places that are important biodiversity hotspots. So let's think about this conservation perspective for a bit more. And this is, I think, where a lot of the additional thinking, studying, and research should be happening. So there are unexploited carbon sinks in the world, And the carbon sink is basically something that through natural processes is storing carbon. The biggest carbon sinks are actually the oceans. Then there is the carbon that is stored in the ground. That's the one that we are looking for, gas and oil and coal. And the other big carbon sink are plants. They convert through photosynthesis. Essentially, they store carbon in their material, and as long as we don't burn it or they don't die, it is stored there. Right? But there is a cycle. There is a natural cycle of carbon in the nature, which right now basically is just, has this additional factor that we are taking it out of the ground and putting it into the air, to be simple. So how can we do the conservation? How can we think about not using up the carbon sinks that have not been exploited? Now, notice this is a bit of a different thinking than the one that we have in the net zero. Right? The net zero sort of starts from the idea we are emitting 40 gigatons of CO2. How can we bring those down to zero? But here the question is, there is coal and gas and oil in Africa. They are not emitting anything right now, but they might want to. And what are we telling them? How do we conserve those carbon sinks, right? How to conserve them? Well, one answer is we strand the assets. That is the whole world goes through regulation, through pricing, essentially makes those assets no longer valuable. That is, to a certain extent, the perspective through which financial markets have been thinking about brown assets has been this, they become stranded, therefore they are a risk for my balance sheet. Implicitly, what we're saying by stranding the brown assets is we make them, somehow we make them valueless. That's a little bit strange to talk in those terms right now when we have an energy crisis and everybody is running around the world and trying to exploit more brown assets, right? And then we are saying at the same time, yeah, but just for a moment, and then afterwards we're going to go back to not using them. But that's an aside, that's a footnote. So one answer, just in very practical terms, what could be an answer to conserve carbon sinks is stranding the assets. The other one is to compensate those who are owning, who are looking after, or actually agreeing to not exploit them, the forests and the things that are in the ground, to somehow compensate them. And now follow me on a very daring thought experiment. If I did an assignment, design a global carbon credit market, what would be the way to do it? And of course, I'm already giving you here a few possible answers. Well, the starting point, I would suggest, is the fact that we have, let's take the 300, if you prefer 500, don't care. Let's take the remaining carbon budget, 300 gigatons, and allocate these emission rights and then trade. Notice that the solution that the world has right now is called Paris Agreement, is essentially allocating the emission rights to the emitters. Because everybody starts from where we are right now and then says, okay, but we are committing to reduce that from where we are. Yeah? What would be alternative ways of thinking about these remaining emission rights? Well, we could be very extreme and say everybody on Earth gets the same. Everybody gets, from the 300 gigatons, everybody gets a certain amount, and then you can sell it. If you don't use it yourself, you can sell it. That would clear a lot of flows into the poorer parts of the world. But yeah, not easy to do. But then if you think about it in those terms, you could also say, oh wow, is that actually a good allocation? Shouldn't we also be taking into account the fact that most of our emissions, I think I have the graph here, most of our emissions, past emissions, are also somehow being caused by somebody. And it's mostly been the industrialized countries, because that is what industrialization has meant. But the truth is that is no longer true. China and India have been are already in terms of their share of the stock of emissions in the air, they already have a significant share too. But let's go back to thinking, okay, maybe past emissions should somehow be taken into account. What about ease of future avoidance? Some countries it may be very easy for them to move to clean energy because they have hydro, because they have other ways, and for others it may be very hard. So should we take that into account? Should we take into account relative vulnerability to climate change? Or should we take into account the ability to provide biodiversity services? You see, I'm putting question marks behind all of these things. It is obvious that this is not the way that we are thinking about the world. I'm just suggesting it is worth thinking about the world for a moment in those terms, because it is the typical thing that an economist does. We want to separate the initial allocation from the result. It's an Edgeworth-Box problem here. You know, how do you design the initial allocation of emission rights, and then afterwards you trade? And in the perfect world, the result in terms of the number of emissions is the same for all, because it's only 300. But of course, the distributional effects are very, very different. And it is easy to think about stories that create a rather large flow from the current high emitters into those who are not emitting much, but maybe the most vulnerable. And, you know, thinking in this greenfield experiment, it's a little bit in this direction that we suggest that the global carbon markets should be going. So and of course, I've already implicitly said quite a bit about climate equity, and so this graph essentially just shows that it's growth. So on the one hand side, we have GDP per capita, on the other one, we have emissions per capita. Growth has tended to be brown. This is across the world, the countries. And this is true in the 90s, it's still true now. But what is also now, what is also true is that there is much, much more diversity across the advanced countries. So in terms of per capita emissions, there is a lot of differentiation that is happening here as countries take different strategies and use this and you know, also take this commitment more or less seriously. Within emerging markets, it's still true. If you grow richer, you emit more. Yeah. So this is showing that we are very far from going in the direction of, you know, only using up the remaining budget. Now, let me come to the second, fiscal constraints, mostly in emerging markets and low-income countries. So we don't do any estimates of the fiscal need for adaptation, but this is something that the IMF has done extensively, and many others are. Right now, when you're, essentially the numbers are going up and up, right? So if you're talking about the whole world, the McKinsey number is somewhere in the 250-ish trillion by 2050. Yeah, so people seem to be somehow putting 3 to 4 trillion investment need for the path to net zero, but most of that is in the advanced world where the emissions are, right? So for the lower income countries, the estimate of adaptation needs, so is about 500 billion. Now, we all know that distress is already high in many low-income countries. This is the World Bank. This is the World Bank classification, basically coming from the DSA, and showing that that more than 50% of low-income countries are at moderate debt distress, are at high amount of debt distress or already in distress. And this is the last year, so we don't have this year's. Of course, this does not get better with increasing interest rates and appreciating dollars. what we do then also, in the report you see we do some empirical exercises that I'm not showing, I'm just showing you the results here. So we investigate how the deficits in different groups of countries react to a climate shock of similar size, and the answer is that the deficits deteriorate significantly more in developing countries than in advanced countries. So they don't have the ability to, in principle, to deal with it, but their fiscal response is larger. Then spreads, we look at spreads in developing countries and advanced countries. And we also find a similar pattern that spreads react much, much more in emerging markets than in advanced countries to external shocks in general. So there we look at a global shock and compare that. And not going the wrong direction, I'm sorry here. And climate change adds significantly to the negative shocks. Wait, so this is, I have already shown, so sorry. This is not the result of that regression, it's just an illustration of how emerging markets and developing countries' spreads are very susceptible to shocks. Here we are seeing the COVID shock, and then again the war, the war shock, yeah. So this is the one I was trying to, yeah. So another finding is that markets are increasingly pricing in climate risk. So there are now a number of climate risk variables, measures, and we look again at how they are pricing them and whether this changes over time, and the answer is yes. Markets or spreads are pricing climate risk more than they did in the past. Moreover, we look at whether the climate risk, the current climate risk is more important or the one that is predicted for the next 10 years. And it is the one that is predicted. So we have, markets are actually starting to look at this risk category, taking it seriously and pricing it in. Now, of course, knowing who is the ones that have the highest risks, which I showed you before, this means it's pushing up borrowing costs for adaptation, among others for adaptation investment, exactly in those countries that need it most, right? So from this sequence of stories that I just told you, it follows that we already know that many developing countries will not be able to finance the needed adaptation investments. So we next turn to looking at finance. And within the finance, the first thing that we looked at is the green bond market. This is a market that has been growing. Let me show you right away here. So that has been growing substantially over the last years. And we are looking here at the sovereign and quasi-sovereign bond issuance. It's not the corporate green bond market, okay? So one idea could be, countries can borrow, if they need, if they have the possibility to go to markets, then they may issue green bonds and they may use them to finance their adaptation needs. Here is what the sovereign green bond market has looked like, and I had to, sorry, because the numbers are too small, I'm writing them out. The scales are very, very different, and that's important in order to look at the sizes. So it's mostly Europe here. These are billions of euros, dollars, 80 in the case of Europe, and 4 in the case of the US. So the US, the green bond market is not a US story, and here it has been mostly local government. And the other big emitters of emissions of green bonds are international organizations, which are about 30 billion. The rest in emerging markets, however, it has been quite popular and has been growing at a nice clip up to about 10 billion now. So green bonds, is that the solution? Yeah, we could ask. They can finance on the green bond market. So what we are looking at here is what is this green bond doing as opposed to let's call it a brown bond? Is it really meaning that there is going to be additional green spending? And the answer is not really. Most of the green bonds, they do not. So let me tell you a story now from Germany. In fact, in the German case, which is a big emitter of green bonds, they are not allowed to commit certain, I mean, by law, it's not allowed to commit certain expenditures categories to certain financing instruments. So it's true that Germany is doing a lot of green investments, but they are decided in the budget law. And then there is the financing. So whether that is financed by something that is called green or brown, de facto doesn't make really a difference. So it's not creating additional green spending than what Germany would have done anyway. Is it a commitment to do something specifically? Typically, green bonds, sovereign green bonds are not. And is it a way to signal, that's another possibility, because the green bonds in the corporate sector, what people have found is that companies that issue green bonds have their stock prices go up. So you're signaling that you are a good company, right? And you having an advantage not on the financing of the green bond necessarily, but on your overall creditor valuation. So, but for sovereigns, that's a bit more difficult to argue or to imagine that this would be an important mechanism, this signaling effect, because in principle, if you want to do green investment, you can say that, you can signal that directly to markets. You don't have to do it through the issuance of special vehicles. We then spent quite a bit of time, and this is where the lawyers really, really engage. We spent quite a bit of time with the so-called greenium. Now, the greenium, what is the greenium? The greenium is, you can define it in two ways. We take the issuer point of view and say a positive greenium is when you have lower financing by issuing green bonds rather than brown bonds, right? So you can lower your financing costs. So is it positive? So that would be a positive greenium. So the question then becomes, well, is it positive? And you may be aware that a lot of the finance colleagues and finance departments are super busy writing papers and publishing papers about the green market, about the yield differences, their effects, etc. So we first review the literature and find it's very mixed. It's not so clear. And then we do an own study, and in which we match sovereign brown and green bonds. And our finding is actually that we have a small 5 basis points, but a significant green penalty. So it's negative, it's not positive. And that it's not significant for emerging markets. So, and it turns out, by looking at it more precisely, that this penalty is mostly due to sovereign-backed issuers. But this is an interesting result. We then look at whether this greenium that we find actually, whether we can explain it. And the answer is we can partly explain it with climate exposure and vulnerability. So it correlates at least with that. So the greenium, which is the good news here is markets are paying attention, right? And they are actually pricing, they take into account that countries that have a larger climate risk need to do more, and therefore there you find a positive greenium. The lawyers then look at the legal texts, and they find no legal obligation. There is absolutely no legal obligation and no legal obligations to do anything if you have issued a green bond. And if Me Too was telling this story, Me Too Gulati, he would be very, very cynical about it. Next, I am going to take about 7 more minutes. Is that fine? Yeah. Okay. The next question that we have is credit. How about credit for climate finance? And here we come to the carbon market. I did before say the carbon market, you know, in a thought experiment. How would we design it if we could? But of course we can't. So what do we have in terms of a carbon market? Well, we know that some of the emissions we will not be able to remove them. We will not be able to mitigate them. We will have to remove them either through natural means or other ways of offsetting the emissions. Compulsory net zero targets for emitters would essentially be a way of making what is today a voluntary carbon market something that could scale. And what we don't say is that, however, this kind of, what that would mean is expanding the compulsory emission carbon markets that are available in certain countries to be much, much larger, because you could actually, any source of carbon emission could be counted as an offset, any source anywhere in the world. And that should incentivize carbon emission reductions and would at the same time become an important source for income for developing countries, as well as a way of conserving those carbon storages I was talking about. So by scaling, by making carbon reduction targets compulsory, but allowing firms to use offsets to fulfill them, and then standardizing these offsets and controlling them, we could, the way to do that would be that we get something akin to a global carbon market. There is already a voluntary carbon market, but it has very different qualities of carbon offset. What you're seeing here, and I encourage you to look at it in the report in more detail, I'm not going to go through all of this, is this here are the ones that remove carbon permanently or almost permanently. Those are the best offsets in the sense that, you're really reducing a ton, you're really taking out a ton from the global emissions. But then there are those where it's not so clear that you are actually doing that. And today, when you buy an offset, and there are many platforms where you can buy offsets, you have mixtures of everything, and you have very different prices, by the way. So these are the verified carbon standards, and this is more or less the price of a ton of carbon. Also in the European trading system is about 70 euros or dollars, same thing these days, per ton. But with these other offsets, they are somewhere between 5 and 10. And the reason is that they don't have the same standard. They're not trying to actually achieve a removal of a ton now. They may tell you, I'm planting a tree, within 10 years, a ton is going to be extracted. But that's not the same thing as removing one now. Last point, debt restructuring and climate. This is actually where the report started from. And now it's become it's where the report still ends, but it's not the main thing. Because the question here was, can we basically beat the Tinbergen rule? We have two goals. We want to reduce, we want to improve climate, and we want to address debt distress. How about debt for climate swaps? Such instruments exist and have been applied, have been known to be applied. Most recently, or one of the recent bigger cases, is Belize. Well, what we find is essentially, if the goal is to provide climate finance, then it's not the best idea, then grants are better. And if the goal is to reduce debt, then you don't want to do an operation where you essentially assume new debt. No? So then essentially the best way to deal with this is restructuring. So we have, if you have two goals, there are two optimal instruments. But And this is the part where I really would encourage you. The chapter then goes into a lot of detail and thinking about what could still be done. So in particular, when you have deep debt restructuring, how could climate finance and climate conditionality be part of that? How it should be part of any DSA, thinking about the financing needs for adaptation and the risks from climate change. In fact, the IMF has revised its DSA, or is in the process, I don't know where we stand there, of taking that into account. And then we are most bullish, in fact, on sustainability-linked instruments. The difference with the green bonds here is there is actually a commitment, there is an outcome. It's not about saying we will invest in green. It's an outcome that is verifiable, and based on that, the instrument pays or doesn't pay. So sustainability-linked bonds is a growing market, and that's where we hope the future might be, because there, again, that might be a way of achieving ultimately the two goals. The list of things to do is long, and there's a whole chapter, but it's absolutely not comprehensive. I would really think that the report, as I said at the beginning, is super rich, and I really hope that you will be able to read it and give us comments and feedback. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very interesting presentation. The graphics in this report, some of which you showed during your presentation, are really wonderful. So I really would urge people to go out and get this report. It's the Geneva Reports in the World Economy, Volume 25, Climate and Debt. And if you have children, I would recommend that you take a look at the Financial Times website, where there is a climate change game, which it's actually quite interesting. I played it with my kids. We were able to limit the temperature increase to 1.52. So we came close, but it was quite informative, because some of the actions you had to take to accomplish even missing the target were really quite politically daunting. So, Beatrice, you preempted the question by my colleague Olivier Blanchard by indicating you were not focused on advanced economies. But another one of my colleagues, Cullen Hendricks, sent me a question which may be a little more on target. Now, Cullen's a good academic, so the question has a lot of wind up to it, so please be patient.
Okay.
The question goes like this. Critical minerals are necessary inputs for sustainable energy systems. Many countries rich in critical minerals are poor and traditionally faced high barriers to accessing the benefits of bond markets. Should financing for projects to help develop critical mineral supply chains be considered mitigation and transition expenditures, and thus count towards the recommended fiscal targets for advanced and high-emitting middle-income countries? Or is financing this aspect of the transition best left to the private sector and conventional sovereign financing mechanisms? So basically, should strengthen critical mineral supply chains, which are necessary for green energy systems, kind of fall under the rubric of the solutions that you and your colleagues lay out in the report?
Well, I guess, as always, the question is, where is the market failure? These critical minerals, if they are exploitable, and we know some of these critical minerals will be absolutely critical for the green technologies, they should be increasing in price enormously. And so a priori, I don't see exactly why the market would not take care of that. So this is actually something that if we decide that we are all going for clean energy, those prices should increase massively, and there should be willingness to exploit this. Now, if there is a market failure of the type that it leads a huge, huge initial investment, and this cannot be financed, but again, you know, these kind of things is where markets actually work well. No?
All right, fair enough. At this point, I would like to open up for questions from the floor. We have a mic stand in the center, and then we have a roving mic. Please introduce yourself. Please indicate who you are. Go ahead, please.
Patrizio Pagano, Bank of Italy. So thank you very much for the presentation. It was really exciting and a lot of food for thought. I have a comment and a question. So my comment is about the fact that you mentioned that, say, Global South is more exposed to climate risk. At the same time, markets are pricing this thing into spreads. Therefore, they don't have the fiscal space to invest. And there is a kind of dupe loop, climate dupe loop, so they cannot do more. So you suggest that the way to break this doom loop is to have this climate conditionality for that destruction. So my sense is that maybe this is the right way to align incentives. I don't know whether that's the only one. But my question is another thing that you didn't mention, and this is the loss and damages. Loss and damages, we are talking about more than $500 billion. And so there is no agreed definition of loss and damages, and they contribute to the stock of emission that you were talking about. So some countries are starting to bring to international courts. I know that, say, Vanuatu is one of these. And it's a big elephant in the room in the climate negotiations. So how should we deal about this in debt restructuring? Thank you.
I think your last question does not refer to debt restructuring alone. No, it's countries that are aggrieved because they are on the receiving end or more on the receiving end of the climate change. I mean, let's face it. There are regions of the world that will benefit from climate change. It's not like we are all equally. We are all on the same planet, but we are not equally affected. So, is this something that will be brought in court and can be brought to court? I don't know, but I think it's a very interesting new development that we're seeing in very small numbers so far. To me, it goes a bit in the same direction as the question of thinking about conservation, because we do have a coincidence of the most affected, most vulnerable tend also to be the ones that have are emitting very little. So we need them to not use their carbon storages. We also need the responsibility essentially lies with the global north to somehow make sure that we find mechanisms that provide sufficient climate financing for adaptation, for damages, and for conservation. But the point for me would be the restructuring case is just a limit case. The more general point is, can we create some kind of global carbon market, global carbon credit market that works?
More questions? Yes, please.
I found your
could you introduce yourself?
Eddie Seiler from Research Institute for Housing America. So I found your maps really interesting, and the north-south issue you just talked about, is so we talk about migration, climate migration, especially that chart where Africa is a sliver, not emitting, yet they're in for the most harm. So what would the effect be? How can we mitigate some of the effects, for instance, migration to the north through this financing?
As you know, most rich countries are not exactly very open to additional migration. So the attempt right now in the world is not to resolve this through migration or only through internal migration, moving away from the areas that are most affected. But if you ask this question in principle, well, yes, I guess humanity would move more towards the poles.
There's a wonderful dystopian novel by the British author Maggie G called The Ice People, which this is all a feint, and we enter a new ice age, and all the Northern Europeans try to exploit family ties and migrate to Africa. It's actually quite an interesting novel. There's a whole part about feminism and stuff. I won't go into that. We have very little time left, probably time for one more question. Yes, please.
Good morning, and first of all, thank you for your presentation. Roberta Casali from the Asian Development Bank. We use quite a lot sustainable finance. We started 2010 with the first thematic bond, which was the water bond, and then we had in 2015 green bonds. Last year, blue bond, the first blue bond. What struck me of the presentation was the reference to the fact that there are no commitments or no strict commitments to the funds, while for us is true exactly the opposite, in the sense that we really think we are creating the capital markets for sustainable finance using those kind of products. And the ingredients are to have a framework, and we use the international like ICMA framework. You should have the pipeline of projects. If not, we are in trouble. And being a multilateral development bank, we have the pipeline of projects. And of course, above all, you should have the trust and the transparency of the operations as a whole. So I will, of course, read very careful the report, which has given lots of thoughts for and good food for thoughts for sure. But I really, this part for me was a little bit.
It's easy to explain.
Yeah.
I was not talking about the international organizations. I mean, basically, you do project financing. We were talking there about sovereign green bonds.
Yeah.
So nationals issuing green bonds, and they tend to be. I mean, they don't tend to be project related. The question is of additionality, fungibility, all of those questions. But there's also. So I was not talking about the Asian Development Bank or other.
No, but what I want to add is the fact that we are not only acting as issuing when
Right.
we issue bonds, but we are transferring this capacity and this knowledge to the development member countries to help them to create their own capital markets, which and in their situation help the corporate of those developing member countries to issue their own green bonds. So in doing this, for sure, there is a great role that multilateral development banks can play, helping the countries to build their markets.
Yes, so I was very, very quick, and that please do read the
Yeah,
chapter
sure.
in more detail, and do give us feedback if you think there is something that we didn't understand. But definitely, I mean, I was maybe a bit too down on the green bond market, because there are ways of improving on it, and there are places that do it better than others. So it's not. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I think the key part of that, the answer that Beatrice gave, was read the report. It is a wonderful, informative report, great graphics, and I would like you, it's the Geneva Reports on the World Economy, Volume 25, Climate and Debt from CPER. And please join me in thanking Beatrice Weder di Mauro for this wonderful presentation of this fascinating, comprehensive, and groundbreaking report from CPER. Thank you.